Hello. How do you do? Welcome to the show, everybody. This is Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lux, and today's a bit of a continuation of the spiritually interconnected thematic episodes I've been doing lately. This was going to be the last one, but I guess it kind of fits in a little bit more as well. This episode, we're going to Russia. Again? Yeah. Somewhat also related to the psychotronics episodes I did and the weird point in history where the Soviet Union almost became a Buddhist theocracy. I don't know if y'all check those episodes out, but if you haven't, please do. Now, this episode, we're going to examine a specific subculture in Russia. One that revolves around urban legends, urban exploration, urban bourbon. No, I'm just saying out loud what I could really go for right now. I'm your host, Mike Lucht. This is an episode on the Stalkers of the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Let's get into it. Oh, I've already fucked up. It's Chernobyl's in Ukraine, actually. So that's one more thing they got to be thankful for. Anywho, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it didn't just leave behind fractured borders and hyperinflation. Bunch of sects of the McMafia running everything in the quote-unquote corporate world. It left behind a physical and psychological wasteland. This is an exploration of the shadows cast by that collapse. Today we're slipping past the checkpoints and stepping through the rusted barbed wire into the 30-kilometer Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. Our guides here are the Stalkers, an illegal underground subculture of urban explorers, mystics, and outlaws who treat this radioactive wilderness not as a toxic necropolis, but as a living psychospiritual entity. To understand them, we have to understand the broken world that birthed them. We will trace the wild, lawless frontier of early 1990s parajournalism, an era where unredacted KGB files, rogue military experiments, and occult theories collided to create a new kind of modern folklore. We'll unpack the terrifying urban legends of the post-Soviet gray zone, map out the perilous routes of the partisans who walk the silent red forest, and examine the bizarre rituals, survival practices, and cosmic beliefs that define the Stalker creed. This isn't just the story of a nuclear disaster or a lesson in urban exploration. It's a journey into a world where science fiction became a physical reality, where a trauma-molded subculture found their sanctuary in the ruins, and where the line between verifiable fact and manufactured mythology has completely dissolved. Welcome to the zone. Tracing the true origin of this story is a bit of a precarious precipice, shifting proposition. The immediate instinct is to look to Chernobyl, to the rupture of reactor number 4, the concrete sarcophagus, and the desperate outlaws slipping through the barbed wire. But that focuses entirely on the physical landscape. The psychological genesis of this mythology actually began a year earlier in Moscow, 1985. Than a massive, brutalist concrete skeleton of the Kovrino district. The locals call it the Kovrino Hospital, or simply the Umbrella, due to its unfinished, tri-winged architectural layout. Decades later, that moniker would take on accidental eerie resonance with the release of the Resident Evil video game franchise, whose primary antagonists are the malicious Umbrella Corporation. For a post-Soviet population navigating a landscape rife with bio-warfare paranoia and state secrecy, this abandoned monument to short-sightedness, a lot of those in the world today, became an early petri dish for for urban legends and conspiracy theories. This blur between interactive media and real-world folklore exploded into a full-scale cultural feedback loop in 2007 when a Ukrainian game studio released Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. The game took the philosophical framework of the classic work of Russian sci-fi known as Roadside Picnic, combined it with the literal geography of the 1986 disaster, and added a fictional second explosion that mutated the landscape, populating it with anomalous physics traps and terrifying monsters. The digital fiction did something unprecedented. It re-engineered reality. The game became a global phenomenon, and a new generation of real-world urban explorers began entering the actual radioactive exclusion zone, explicitly mapping their experiences onto the game's mechanics. These real-life stalkers didn't just steal the name from fiction. They adopted the game's terminology, spoke in its specific slang, and treated certain structures like the Duga over-the-horizon radar array with the same mythic reverence programmed into the digital code. It created a strange modern Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail, symbolizing cycles of self-perpetuating nature. Anyway, where a 1970s novel inspired a 1980s tragedy, which birthed a 2000s video game, which ultimately dictated the exact rituals, jargon, and folklore of the actual flesh-and-blood outlaws patrolling the ruins today. The HZB, Hovrinskaya Zabroshennaya Bolnitsa, the Kovrino Abandoned Hospital. Originally commissioned by the Soviet state in 1980, it was intended to be a crown jewel of late Soviet healthcare. Sprawling state-of-the-art medical complex capable of housing 1,300 beds. The grand design was fundamentally flawed from inception. Construction ground to a definitive halt when engineers realized the entire concrete foundation had been poured over a network of forgotten subterranean marshes and an old riverbed. Way to go, Soviet Union. The structural failure was immediate. The immense concrete wings began to sink unevenly into the mud, fracturing the structural integrity of the lower levels. Water rapidly flooded the vast multi-tiered sub-basements, swallowing the bottom floors in a perpetual freezing subterranean lake. By 1985, the state walked away, leaving behind a massive multi-story freestanding ruin. And a ruin of that scale in late Soviet Moscow attracted everything. The goths, the punks, the drug dealers, not to equate those groups together or anything, and more than anyone else, the early generation of urban explorers. They were called the Stalkers, even back then, long before the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone made the word famous globally. But according to the deep lore of the Moscow underground, the concrete labyrinth attracted something far more sinister. A group known as the Nemostor. The name Nemostor doesn't exist in any official police files or state criminal registries. Instead, it exists almost exclusively in the archives of post-Soviet parajournalism. In the pages of fringe underground newspapers like Golos Veselinoy, or Voice of the Universe, or the Anomalia Research Bulletin. To an outsider, these publications might seem comparable to Western tabloids like the National Enquirer or Weekly World News. Perfectly fine, if not outright admirable publications in and of themselves, for what they are. But their execution was entirely different. They weren't winking at the reader. They didn't trade in sensationalist punchlines. These articles were written by former Soviet engineers, decommissioned military officers, and defunded institutional scientists. The prose was dry, clinical, and intensely bureaucratic, as fits the Soviet style of the time. They treated the occult and the anomalous with the same rigorous mechanical precision that they'd once used to document state science. There's a psychological reason this format was so potent. Under the Soviet system, if a piece of text was printed, it carried the weight of absolute state authority. 70 years of strict ideological censorship had conditioned the Russian populace to believe that the truth, quote-unquote, the truth, was whatever managed to survive redaction and make it to the ink. So when these clinical investigative bulletins published detailed breakdowns of an alleged satanic death cult operating in the dark, waterlogged belly of Kovrino, the public didn't read it as fiction. They read it as a leaked intelligence report. According to the parajournalist, the Nemostor had constructed a sophisticated subterranean temple within the dry, middle-tier basements of the hospital ruins, a sector completely shielded from outside light and casual explorers. The concrete walls were allegedly emblazoned with massive pentagrams painted in black soot and engine oil. The folklore claims their rituals began with animal sacrifices, drawing from Moscow's massive population of stray cats and dogs. That's how you know your country's doing really good. You got packs of wild dogs running everywhere. But as the group's insular fanaticism deepened, the rumors shifted to human sacrifices. Homeless people, drunks, runaway teenagers, and solitary urban explorers who ventured into the pitch-black corridors alone, completely unaware that the concrete maze was already occupied. The legend of the HZB grew to encompass more than just the cult itself. The building was said to possess a malevolent geography. Stalkers whispered about the trap, specific unfinished elevator shafts concealed by shadows where the floor simply vanished, dropping unsuspecting trespassers multiple stories down into the freezing, flooded lower basements. It was said that the water down there never completely froze, even in the dead of a Moscow winter, and that the flooded shafts held the weighted-down remains of those who crossed paths with the Nemo store in the dark. Long before the military got involved, the local authorities were already struggling to contain a mounting stack of missing persons reports and bizarre police interventions. The most pervasive piece of early neighborhood folklore involves an elderly woman whose dog vanished near the property. Armed with only a flashlight, she ventured inside the concrete shell to track her pet's whimpering. A week later, police discovered her body at the bottom of a deep foundation pit, her ribs and legs shattered by the fall. It's not hard to break old people. I mean, if you cut one, you can deglove their whole arm. Anyways, the disturbing consensus in the local parajournalism bulletins was that she hadn't died on impact. She'd spent days screaming into the empty corridors, but the building's brutalist geometry muffled her cries until she succumbed to dehydration. As the 90s wore on, the hospital, which the Stalkers began calling the Citadel of Darkness, gradually transformed from a physical ruin into a site of active, documented tragedies. It became a magnet for suicides, the most infamous of which occurred in 2005. A 16-year-old boy named Alexei Kreushkin, known by his stalker moniker of Cray, climbed to the edge of an unfinished upper floor and threw himself into the concrete abyss, reportedly driven by despair of unrequited love. Then the tragedy became a sacred marker within the subculture, however. The walls of that floor were quickly covered in massive, mournful graffiti, tributes to Cray, reading, "Cray, we will remember you forever," converting the structural ruin into a literal shrine to the dead. But the fringe bulletins insisted that these deaths were fuel for an ambient supernatural malice. Visitors began reporting intense poltergeist activity and full-body apparitions flickering in the twilight, full-torso vapors. Witnesses described seeing strange cone-shaped silhouettes pacing the corridors, accompanied by the disembodied sound of children mourning or screaming from locked, empty rooms. The prevailing belief among the occult-leaning parajournalists was that the Nemo store's blood rites hadn't just been symbolic. They had actively torn a hole in the fabric of the location, conjuring an autonomous predatory entity that fed on the despair of the homeless, the drunks, and the isolated explorers who vanished into the structure without a trace. The climax of the Nemo store story, the part every Russian urbex kid knows by heart, is the Oman raid. Oman, or Omo, O-M-O-N, or O-M-O-H, is a prominent and heavily armed branch of the Russian National Guard, primarily functioning as riot police and a paramilitary gendarmerie force. In English, it translates to Special Purpose Mobile Unit. The raid is said to have taken place sometime in the mid-90s, triggered by the escalating disappearances of teenagers and a frantic local police force realization that they were completely outgunned by what was hiding within the ruins. According to the underground lore, the assault wasn't a standard police sting. It was a military eradication campaign. Eyewitnesses in the Kovrino district reported blacked-out transport trucks and armored personnel carriers surrounding the concrete perimeter under the cover of a moonless midnight. Heavily geared Oman operators carrying assault rifles, tactical shields, and industrial explosives, as one does, breached the entry points, their heavy boots echoing against the raw concrete. Armed with powerful spotlights that cut through decades of stagnant dust, they descended level by level into the dark. The myth describes a frantic, claustrophobic pursuit through the concrete maze. The cultists, caught completely by surprise, retreated down the rusted stairwells into their pitch-black subterranean strongholds, attempting to use their intimate knowledge of the flooded basements to evade capture. But the Oman units had no intention of navigating a tactical nightmare in the dark. Instead of staging a room-by-room sweep, the paramilitary teams allegedly used heavy demolition charges to seal the escape routes behind the fleeing group. They drove the Nemo store deep into the lowest, uncompleted drainage vaults of the hospital, a dead-end bunker directly beneath the water table. The legend states that once the cultists were pinned inside the subterranean chamber, the operators didn't bother trying to clear the room. They set explosive breaching charges on the main support structures and retaining walls holding back the subterranean marshes. With a massive muffled detonation that shook the entire district, the concrete shattered, intentionally flash flooding the lowest levels with thousands of gallons of freezing mud and toxic river water, drowning the cultists alive inside their own temple, if you will. And if you believe the parajournalists, you could still hear them screaming throughout the lower levels of the ruins. Urban explorers who descended into the flooded elevator shafts claimed they could hear muffled chanting, splashing, and the sound of bodies moving through brackish black water. The hospital became so saturated with death, accidental falls, suicides, occult energies, etc., that the Russian government finally spent 1 billion rubles to demolish it in 2018. They buried the physical remains of the legend under a modern apartment complex. One that's probably in no way at all surely also haunted. Oh, wait! While the physical monolith of the HCB is completely gone, having been fully demolished in late 2018 to make way for a massive, modern, multi-building residential development known as Zik Moy Adresnaklinskoy. Oh, I'm going to be offensively bad at Russian in this episode, the Russian language, so just bear with me. It translates to the My Address on Klinskaya Residential Complex. While the state-backed urban renewal program successfully flattened the concrete, it failed to erase the local mythology. Because the apartment complex was built directly over the footprint of the Citadel of Darkness. Subterranean basements, flooded tunnels, and all, the location immediately became a lightning rod for modern internet folklore and residential anxieties. The distinct body of contemporary post-demolition folklore had begun leaking into Moscow urbex forums, real estate review boards, probably the worst, and social media channels. The earliest complaints from real estate looky-loos and new tenants were grounded in structural realities that immediately fed back into the older legends. The apartment complex is notoriously plagued by severe foundational dampness, pooling water in the subterranean parking garages, and constant pump failures. To the engineers, it's a predictable consequence of building high-rises on the same shifting marshes and underground riverbeds that sank the original hospital in 1985. But to the paranormal community, the explanation is a little more ominous. The flooded lower tiers of the Nemostor Temple were never truly drained or cleared. They were merely capped, concreted over. The restless water, still holding whatever dark history occurred before the Oman raid, is actively trying to reclaim the surface. On Russian paranormal forums and local neighborhood channels, a handful of specific, reoccurring claims have emerged from residents and late-night security guards patrolling the new property. There's the subterranean hum. Security personnel and residents on the lower floors have reported a low-frequency mechanical vibration or dull thrumming sound radiating from the deepest parts of the utility basements. Unlike standard plumbing hums, witnesses claim the sound has an organic, rhythmic pulse that triggers an instantaneous wave of irrational nausea and spatial disorientation. Whoa. A clinical footprint identical to the old existential dread associated with the torsion field and psychotronic lore. There's echoes in the shafts, in the modern elevators and central stairwells, tenants have reported hearing faint metallic clanging and distant, hollow thuds traveling through the walls, as though something heavy is repeatedly falling from a great height deep within the structural core. Local youth quickly branded these acoustic anomalies as the Cray echoes, claiming the architecture itself retained a structural memory of the elevator shaft tragedies mentioned earlier. Perhaps the most unsettling claims come from the outdoor parking areas and courtyards at twilight. Dashcam footage and midnight dog walkers occasionally note anomalous, uncast shadows shifting across the pristine concrete paths against the ambient glow of the streetlights. Midnight dog walkers, you guys probably see a lot of weird shit. These aren't described as traditional ghosts, but as those same familiar, autonomous, cone-shaped silhouettes that once paced the ruins of the HZB, seemingly trapped on the grid where the brutalist structure used to sit. Ultimately, the transformation of the site has created a classic psychogeographic irony. The city attempted to overwrite a 30-year monument to death, cults, and state failure, with the ultimate symbol of domestic stability, family apartments. Yet by forcing thousands of people to sleep, live, and park directly on top of an unexercised urban legend, the folklore didn't die. It simply found a brand new audience to haunt. Likewise, the name Nemo Store also outlived the building. Trespassers stopped saying that they were going to Covrino. Instead, they began saying they were going to Nemo Store. The word had become the place. Kind of like how many Americans will refer to all sodas as Coke, or all artificially sweetened ground-up powdered hooves consumed for dessert, or used as the primary ingredient in white trash frat party pre-booze-infused gelatinous slop as Jell-O. Annie Weasley. This specific example, illustrated by the dark urban legends of the Covrino Hospital and its allegedly devilish Nemo Store inhabitants, is crucial to understanding the profound psychological shift that followed the Soviet Union's collapse. The infrastructure of state secrecy didn't simply disappear, it metastasized. When the USSR dissolved in 1991, thousands of highly classified facilities were suddenly left unmanned. Psychotronic research labs, biological weapons stations, and sprawling underground bunkers. The scientists were defunded, the gates unlocked, and the security guards left unpaid. Into this massive institutional vacuum rushed a curious, desperate new breed of urban explorers and parajournalists. This lawless informational landscape is what gave birth to parajournalism. Heard me use that phrase several times already. It's a chaotic blend of rogue investigative reporting, unredacted state data, and sensationalized fringe science. In the early 1990s, the collapse of state censorship meant that tabloid newspapers and self-published pamphlets suddenly enjoyed total freedom, but also, conversely, lacked any institutional guardrails or editorial oversight. Writers operating in this space weren't bound by traditional journalistic ethics. Instead, they weaponized the newly opened state archives, mixing leaked KGB files with occult theories and Cold War paranoia to feed a public that was suddenly obsessed with the hidden mechanisms of their former government. It was an era where rumor carried the weight of leaked truth. And the more bizarre the revelation, the more credible it seemed to a traumatized population. Yet this wild media ecosystem did far more than just shock the public. It actively shaped the post-Soviet perception of high strangeness in all its forms. By presenting paranormal encounters, cryptid sightings, and alien visitations alongside leaked military data, these periodicals effectively flattened the line between state intelligence and cosmic horror. Historical analysts have since raised a compelling, darker possibility that these bizarre publications weren't entirely the product of rogue independent writers. Instead, some may have been covertly weaponized as a new form of deniable propaganda, an invisible arm of a burgeoning deep state operating within the ruins of the failed empire. By deliberately fostering a public belief in vast, terrifying government programs involving psychotronics, mind control, or extraterrestrial recoveries, elements of the old intelligence apparatus could maintain an aura of omnipotence. Looking at you, Putin. No. Omnipotence, Putin? I don't think so. I don't know how many times he's fallen down the stairs and pooped his pants at this point, but much like all old men in power, they're going to die sooner or later. If the population believed the state still possessed secret, physics-defying weapons, the illusion of total control could survive, even when the government itself was bankrupt. It was a masterful exercise in perception management, steering public paranoia away from political reality and into the realm of the cosmic. Eventually, this deluge of deep Eurasian weirdness began to leak past the old borders of the Iron Curtain, introducing Western audiences to an entirely separate paradigm of the anomalous. This is about the time that America found out about things like the Dyatlov Pass incident, for example. The primary bridge between these two worlds was a researcher, author, and former Soviet refugee named Paul Stonehill, at least in my eyes. The primary bridge is Paul Stonehill. Born in Kiev, Stonehill became one of the most remarkable and prolific figures to emerge from this informational ecosystem. Armed with an astonishing knowledge of secret, forbidden, and forgotten Eurasian history, his work, such as the Soviet UFO files, offered the West its first comprehensive look at paranormal phenomena through a distinctly Soviet lens. Whether operating through his deep network of native researchers or evaluating files that survived the collapse, Stonehill documented accounts of military UFO encounters, underwater anomalies, and state-sponsored psychic research with an unvarnished, captivating intensity. For decades, his contributions have served as an invaluable archive for anyone trying to map out the true depth of Eurasian high strangeness, honoring the forgotten researchers of the East while providing a brilliant, endlessly intriguing window into the hidden anomalies of the former Soviet Empire. It was exactly this class of deep state secrets, the kind of forbidden military/scientific archives that researchers like Stonehill worked to unearth, that became the lifeblood of the 90s tabloids. In the hands of raw parajournalists, these classified projects lost their dry academic isolation and were thrown directly into the public consciousness. A single issue of a 1993 Underground Bulletin read like an inventory of cosmic paranoia. Editors didn't just focus on standard flying saucers, they curated a dark, eclectic menu of Eurasian anomalies that stretched across continents, including such famous or infamous stories as the Kashtim Dwarf or the baby Alyoshenko, the astonishing account of a tiny mummified humanoid creature discovered by an elderly woman in the Urals, rumored to be a biological entity salvaged from a secret nuclear waste storage disaster. Yeah, the story of the Lake Baikal swimmers. I'm sure most of my listeners have heard me harp on this story before. Reports detailing classified Soviet Navy diving expeditions in 1982 that supposedly encountered giant silver-suited humanoid entities swimming without breathing apparatus in the freezing depths of Lake Baikal, the biggest and deepest and oldest freshwater lake in the world. The Almaty Biovolna Clinic leaked reports of private, unregulated medical facilities operating in Kazakhstan that claim to cure terminal illnesses by exposing patients to directed low-frequency cosmic radiation fields, or Siberian sorcery in subterranean bases. Articles tracking reports from distant Siberian and Far Eastern regions where ancient indigenous shamanic rites were allegedly being mapped and weaponized by the state inside hollowed-out mountain installations. But of all the bizarre topics clogging the printing presses, the true crown jewel of post-Soviet parajournalism was the weaponization of the human mind itself. This was the frontier where state engineering collided with absolute psychological terror, the science of psychotronics. Now, this psychotronic frontier is an incredibly deep, paranoid rabbit hole all on its own. Depending on how our time holds up today, after we finish exploring the Stalker subculture, we're either going to dive straight into the rest of these post-Soviet urban legends and parajournalism mysteries later on in this episode, or we'll pivot them into companion episodes of this one, so that way we can give them the sheer terrifying scope and breathing room that they deserve. But regardless of when we pull back that curtain, the foundation of it all begins right here, buried inside the fringe periodicals of the early 1990s. The writers of these investigative columns didn't present these psychological experiments as mere science fiction or campfire ghost stories. They treated them as chilling documented fact. They wrote about KGB Unit 10003, Soviet Psychotronic Warfare Division, with the same dry precision they'd used to report on grain yields. They claimed that when the funding cut out, Rogue researchers sold military-grade torsion field generators to the mafia, or worse, left them running on standby inside of abandoned military outposts near Novosibirsk. Torsion fields, hypothetical high-frequency electromagnetic waves engineered with a single purpose: to alter human brainwaves, induce compliance, and implant thoughts. Implant thoughts. Implant thoughts. The parajournalists reported that in the sweltering summer of 1992, factory workers in several closed industrial towns simultaneously began experiencing violent auditory hallucinations, a rhythmic static buzzing that quickly induced acute paranoia and catatonia. Investigative tabloids like Top Secret or Soversheno Sekretno traced the anomalies to abandoned high-powered Soviet military transmitters left running on automated standby, broadcasting unmonitored frequencies into the wilderness. Today, the documentation of these incidents exists in a gray zone between verifiable fact and manufactured folklore. Yet the science underlying these terrifying accounts was anchored in reality. Declassified files reveal that the USSR had poured up to $1 billion into a psychotronic arms race, researching how high-frequency electromagnetic fields could alter human biochemistry. Researchers like American neuroscientist Alan Frey had already proven the existence of the microwave auditory effect, the biological reality that specific radio frequencies could bypass the ears and generate phantom clicks, hisses, and buzzing directly inside of the human skull. By 1993, the chaos had grown so palpable that the Russian State Duma actively drafted legislation to regulate psychotronic weaponry, while former security officials issued frantic internal memos warning that bankrupt researchers were selling military-grade generators to the Russian mafia. For more info on the whole mind-bending and sometimes even quite terrifying semi-secret history of Soviet psychotronics, like I said, check out my previous episodes covering this particular era of weird, forbidden history. Ultimately, this sudden explosion of the supernatural was the inevitable hangover of a regime that had ruthlessly enforced 70 years of absolute scientific materialism. For nearly a century, the state decree was absolute. No ghosts, no UFOs, no gods, etc. When that ideological dam broke in 1991, the psychological flood wasn't merely political. It was theological, it was cosmic, and it was terrifying. Which brings us to Chernobyl. Eventually. First, we need to understand the etymology. Chernobyl. Everyone in the West, at least everyone that's vaguely familiar with Slavic folklore, big numbers, here's the name and thinks of Chernobog, the black god, the Slavic deity of death and chaos. But that's a false etymology. Linguistically, Chernobyl actually derives from Chorny bilia, or black grass. It refers specifically to mugwort and its bitter botanical cousin, wormwood, plants distinguished by their dark purple-black stems. In the modern West, mugwort has reemerged as a popular wellness supplement and oneirogen, prized by those seeking to trigger vivid, lucid dreams or taken as a bitter tonic to force the stomach to produce gastric acid. Wormwood itself anchors an even darker chapter in Western cultural history as the primary botanical ingredient in absinthe. In 19th century Paris, this emerald green drink was romanticized as La Fille Verte, the Green Fairy, a drink believed to bestow poetic inspiration, expand the mind, and induce vivid, waking hallucinations. Artists and poets blamed it for its unique mad delirium, a state of mind distinct from mere drunkenness. But this seemingly benign backyard grass family harbors a darker, more volatile pharmacology than the bohemian cafes ever realized. The alleged hallucinatory magic of the fairy drink came down to thujone, the very same neurotoxin found in both wormwood and mugwort that, in high doses, misfires the brain and causes violent convulsions. More critically, the plant functions as a potent immunogogue, a substance that aggressively stimulates blood flow to the pelvic cavity. Take it to ease cramps, and it acts as a medicine. Take it while pregnant, and its unintended side effect is total devastation. It forces uterine contractions, operating as an involuntary abortifacient. It's due to this dual nature, a plant of deep sleep, toxic bitterness, and the termination of life, that made the biblical connection seize the post-Soviet public imagination. Revelations 8:10 through 11, quote, And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter." Unquote. When the sky over Ukraine turned toxic in 1986, a traumatized population looked at the black grass beneath their feet and realized they were standing on the literal geography of the apocalypse. Today, if you visit the ghost town of Chernobyl, you'll find the Wormwood Star Memorial in the center, a metallic angel blowing a trumpet. The government literally memorialized the biblical prophecy. Quite odd, one would think, for a supposed so-called glorious Soviet Socialist Republic, but hey, I'm just a whack job podcast conspiracy theorist / amateur folklorist who sees the nefarious pre-scripted prophecies of the Judeo-Christian apocalypse plotted out by those in power at just about every turn, so maybe it's just me. Moving on. The exclusion zone isn't just a religious symbol. It's a physical reality born from a nightmare of engineering. On April 26, 1986, plant operators at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in Soviet Ukraine initiated a late-night safety test on reactor number 4. They were operating on an RBMK reactor, a massive Soviet-designed beast engineered for maximum power and cheap construction. Oh, those good old Soviets. But the RBMK possessed a hidden, volatile architecture. It used thousands of high-pressure channels of water for cooling, but a massive core of solid graphite to keep the nuclear reactions running. This design created a fatal vulnerability known as high positive void coefficient. In simple terms, if the cooling water boiled away into steam, the nuclear reaction didn't slow down. It accelerated exponentially. More steam meant more power, creating a runaway thermal loop. Worse still, the boron control rods meant to shut the system down were tipped with graphite. When operators pressed the emergency shutdown button, those graphite tips entered the core first. Instead of acting as a brake, they acted as a detonator. Within seconds, the power surged completely out of control. Inside the control rooms and turbine halls, the air grew instantly heavy, charged with a sudden, deafening mechanical scream. The plant workers didn't have time to process the failing gauges before the physics of the runaway RBMK reactor caught up to them. For the men stationed closest to the core, death was instantaneous. Incomprehensible blasts of pure thermal and kinetic force. The flash of heat inside the reactor compartment spiked to thousands of degrees in a fraction of a millisecond. It was an environment so violent that it defied standard trauma. The superheated atmospheric wave instantly superboiled the moisture inside the human body. For those caught directly in the path of the thermal surge, the moisture trapped inside the enamel and pulp of their teeth expanded so violently and with such sudden pressure that their teeth literally detonated outward like popcorn, shattering through the jaw and exploding like kernels of popcorn in a white-hot flash of agony. Ugh. Then the blast wave hit. A massive steam explosion tore through the structural concrete, throwing men against the steel bulkheads and blowing the 2,000-ton shield right off the top of the reactor hull, followed instantly by a second cataclysmic hydrogen explosion. The core was torn wide open to the sky. And those who survived the mechanical impact staggered out into hallways filled with toxic steam and black dust, their skin already turning deep brown from the invisible lethal wash of ionizing radiation. Below them, the exposed graphite blocks caught fire, burning like a radioactive charcoal kiln for 10 straight days and lifting a toxic plume of invisible fire into the atmosphere. The resulting fallout was catastrophic. The plume of smoke launched an invisible shroud of highly radioactive isotopes, including iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90, straight into the upper atmosphere. It was an invisible toxic cloud carrying 400 times more radioactive material than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It drifted across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and eventually all of Western Europe, setting off radiation alarms as far away as Sweden. Soviet authorities initially tried to conceal the disaster. But within 36 hours, the nearby city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 plant workers and their families, was evacuated in a frantic 2-hour scramble. The residents were told they would return in 3 days. They left everything behind, creating a frozen Soviet ghost town preserved in rust. To contain the invisible wildfire, the Soviet government deployed hundreds of thousands of quote-unquote liquidators, soldiers, miners, and firefighters who sacrificed their health to bulldoze irradiated villages, bury topsoil, and construct a hasty concrete sarcophagus over the ruined reactor. They drew a massive line on the map, cordoning off 1,000 square miles of the contaminated countryside. The cataclysm carved out the 30-kilometer wasteland of exclusion, now known simply as the Zone. That's roughly about 18 and a half, 19 miles for Americans. I know you can't stand the kilometers. To navigate this space is to learn a completely separate language, born from the subterranean culture of the trespassers themselves. The outer boundary, the heavily armed, militarized border of barbed wire, guard towers, and motion sensors, is called the perimeter. Everything outside that fence, the entire regular modern world of traffic, bills, and grocery stores, is dismissed by the Stalkers as the Big Earth. But once you cross the perimeter, you leave the Big Earth behind. Inside is the Zone, and the Zone is alive. Not in a traditional biological sense, but psycho-spiritually. It operates like an autonomous, sentient entity with its own shifting moods and inscrutable preferences. It isn't just a collection of ruined buildings and irradiated soil. It's a territory that watches back. It will capriciously open a safe path for one explorer, only to turn around and utterly destroy the next without a second thought. What makes this subculture so unnerving is that it was entirely prophesied. Terminology, the concept, the very word stalker doesn't come from Soviet military doctrine. It comes from a 1972 Soviet sci-fi masterpiece called Roadside Picnic, written by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. In the novel, aliens briefly visit Earth and leave behind several zones, dangerous, cordoned-off areas littered with incomprehensible, lethal extraterrestrial debris. To the aliens, it was just trash left behind from a casual roadside picnic. To humanity, it was a landscape of physics-defying anomalies that could tear a man apart or grant his deepest desires. The desperate, illegal guides who snuck into these cordoned-off areas to scavenge the alien artifacts were called Stalkers. When director Andrei Tarkovsky adapted the book into his haunting 1979 film Stalker, he visualized the Zone as a lush, overgrown, abandoned wasteland guarded by military checkpoints. The juxtaposition is staggering. Art didn't just imitate life. It constructed the vocabulary for a catastrophe. 7 years after Tarkovsky's film hit Soviet screens, reactor number 4 blew. When the Soviet government evacuated a 30-kilometer ring around the power plant, erected barbed wire, and set up military checkpoints, they accidentally engineered a perfect real-world replica of the Strugatsky brothers' fiction. The term stalker instantly shifted from science fiction to literal journalism as illegal scavengers and explorers began slipping past the Ukrainian guards. Within this modern real-world stalker subculture are what's known as partisans. That means they walk. No vehicles, no roads. 30 kilometers through the Red Forest, the most contaminated area. The trees turned ginger brown after the blast. They died standing. Now it's just this silent, frozen forest. No birds, no insects. Well, there's some insects, but the silence is absolute. And in that silence, your mind starts to manufacture sounds. Children laughing, distant but distinct, coming from the tree line. Always occurring during times when there are absolutely no children present, so pretty much always, or at least one would hope that to be the case. Then again, given the context of haunting auditory horrors, there's really no ideal situation that's applicable to this scenario. The Zone has been evacuated for 25 years, but explorers hear them, clear as anything, playing, singing Soviet pioneer songs, no less. The Whispering Woods, that's what the old stalkers call it. But it's not ghosts, it's radiation affecting the temporal lobes. Auditory hallucinations are a documented symptom of acute exposure. That is, if it isn't attributed to the derelict psychotronic broadcasts that allegedly permeate the atmosphere. But knowing any of that probably doesn't help when you're standing in the dark and the laughter seems to just keep getting closer In Pripyat, the ghost city, the power grid was severed in 1986. There was no electricity, but sometimes, on the 9th floor of an abandoned apartment block, you'd see a flickering yellow light, or a blue light. Stalkers debate what it is. Some say it's the glow of radioactive isotopes, Chernobyl radiation interacting with dust. Others say it's rival stalkers camping, but the old-timers say it's the buildings remembering that the city is trying to power itself back on, trying to wake up. The stalker subculture has its own language, its own code. The dictionary is essential. If you don't know the words, you won't survive. The zone is the zone. The perimeter is the border. The big earth is the world outside. So mostly are the self-settlers, the elderly who refused evacuation and still live in the villages. The stalkers would bring them medicine, newspapers, vodka, and other basic everyday survival items. In return, they offered shelter and warnings of where the military patrols were. The horsemen, the police, cavalry. They patrol on horseback sometimes, or in vehicles. They have drones now, thermal imaging. The game of hide and seek has gotten far more sophisticated. Now the checklist of required equipment. A stalker's entire life must be compressed into a single tactical backpack or rucksack, weighing strictly between 25 and 35 kilograms. Any heavier, the physical toll of a 30-kilometer march will break your knees. Any lighter, and you're leaving behind the tools that keep you alive. Clipping onto your shoulder strap is the most vital instrument in the wasteland, a personal dosimeter. Stalkers rely almost exclusively on the Ecotest Terra P, or the rugged military-grade Terra N. Compact, yellow, handheld Geiger-Müller counters engineered to measure ambient gamma radiation and beta particle flux. It's left on continuously, so its sharp, erratic clicking acts as an external nervous system, warning you when an invisible border has been crossed. Next are the water filters, portable Sawyer squeeze systems, or heavy-duty mechanical pump filters. In the zone, water is a paradox. You can't carry enough for a multi-day trek, forcing you to harvest directly from the radioactive Pripyat River or stagnant swamps, relying on hollow fiber membranes to strain out the hyper-lethal hot particle silt. For illumination, your kit requires dedicated red or green LED tactical flashlights. Standard white light is an absolute death sentence. Its high-visibility beam will instantly alert the Ukrainian National Guard, border patrols, or drone networks monitoring the woods. Red light preserves night vision and drops beneath the tree line, while green light vanishes against the dense foliage. For sustenance, the pack is stuffed with high-calorie canned pork or beef known as tushanka, the ubiquitous, gelatinous Soviet military staple, and invariably a flask of cheap vodka. In stalker culture, vodka is referred to as the chaos fuel, a dark, double-edged colloquialism. On one level, it nods to the old, unscientific liquidator myth that heavy alcohol consumption helps flush radionuclides from the thyroid. On a deeper psychological level, it's the chemical fuel required to quiet the mind, a necessary anesthetic against the crushing isolation and existential dread of the wasteland. The infiltration begins at midnight. The preferred entry point is the Joppa Gap, a notorious specific breach in the southern perimeter fence where the forest swallows the barbed wire line. Once through, you must dodge the mechanized border patrols before embarking on a brutal 30-kilometer trek through the primeval swamps. The primary rule of evasion is absolute: never touch the asphalt. Stalkers strictly avoid roads and paved paths because tarmac and asphalt act as physical sponges for radioactive fallout, retaining dense pockets of cesium-137 that never quite wash away. Furthermore, the military forces focus their night vision drone surveillance directly along these paved corridors. You trek through the raw, pathless forest instead, navigating mud and thickets until your boots are ruined and your joints ache, moving in absolute disciplined silence. Upon reaching the ghost cities of Pripyat or Chernobyl II, survival requires a highly specific tactical maneuver known within the subculture as apartment castling. You enter a decaying Soviet-era concrete high-rise and ascend immediately to the 5th floor or higher. The ground floors are death traps. They're plagued by stagnant, high radioactive dust pools and are easily breached by roaming military patrols or wild animals. Once you secure an upper-level flat, you castle the position. You hang heavy blackout curtains over the doorway and drag damp, rotting mattresses from the bedrooms to jam tightly into the window frames. This creates a dual barrier. It completely kills any accidental light leaking from your tactical gear and deadens the acoustic profile of your movements. Inside the castle, the rhythm of life flips. You maintain absolute, motionless silence by day, sleeping on the concrete, and save your movement, cooking, and scavenging strictly for the cover of night. Why do these people go? Because the zone is honest. Outside in the big earth, everything is a construct of lies. Bureaucracy, social performance, systemic corruption. The zone doesn't lie. It doesn't care about your status, your wealth, or your politics. It just kills you, or it doesn't. It's entirely fair in its malice. But the price of entry is the mind. As the days bleed together, the sensory deprivation of the dead rooms takes hold, and the parapsychological pressure of the territory begins to warp your perceptions. You see the shadow drifts pacing the edges of your vision. You hear the phantom, hollow laughter echoing up the dry plumbing shafts. The modern stalkers know that the zone ultimately shows you exactly what you need to see. It acts as a mirror, stripping away the civilized veneer, your ego, and your comforting illusions until you're forced to meet your true primal self in the pitch-black dark. That's the real pilgrimage. It was never about the famous locations, the photographs, or the salvageable artifacts. The true destination is the raw, unvarnished self that emerges when you are completely alone in a dead city, irradiated, dehydrated, and you still look into the dark and choose to go deeper. One of the major social faux pas, or total fuck-ups, amongst the stalker subculture is theft. When you're in the zone, you never loot from the apartments, never take souvenirs from the schools, no gas masks, no medals, no children's toys. You leave history untouched just as you found it. You take nothing but photographs. You leave nothing but footprints and the stashes. Throughout Pripyat, stalkers have established hidden apartments. They bring up mattresses, canned food, medicine, batteries, water filters, etc. They leave them there for the next group. If you use a stash, you replace what you took. If you don't, word gets around, you're blacklisted or worse. The zone takes you. It's not superstition, it's survival. The stash law is the unspoken social contract that keeps people alive in the wilderness that's ultimately indifferent to human life. By mandating that every explorer leave behind a fraction of their supplies, a dry match, a tin of meat, a handful of ammunition, for the next wanderer, this law transforms a hostile wasteland into something approaching habitable. It creates a mutual network of care in an environment that's, for all intents and purposes, entirely designed to kill you. But navigating this landscape requires more than just respect for the stash law. It requires a map of the anomalies themselves. So what follows is a guided tour through the primary landmarks of the exclusion zone. We'll cross the thresholds of its most notorious contaminated sectors, mapping out the unwritten rules, the survival regulations, and the dark industrial folklore that handles each location not as a collection of dead concrete, but as a territory with a distinct and dangerous personality. Before crossing the perimeter, you partake in the first sacrament. You drink vodka. Cheap vodka, preferably in large amounts. However, not so much as to impair one's ability to keep their wits about them. On one level, it's a deliberate ritualistic nod to the Strugatsky novel, where the original stalkers drank heavily to steel their nerves before entering the alien zones. But inside the exclusion zone, folklore always dresses itself up as utility. The modern stalkers firmly believe that alcohol acts as a biological shield, helping to flush radiation from the thyroid and protect the blood. Whether the science holds up under a microscope is entirely besides the point. In a desperate landscape, it provides the perfect, legitimate justification to drink. That is, if you really need one. For generations, vodka has been the traditional tool used to survive the dual brutalities of a punishing climate and a ruthless state. But at the edge of the exclusion zone, this everyday spirit was transformed into a secular sacrament, a protective elixir consumed on the threshold of another world. Once past the wire, the journey ceases to be a simple hike and becomes an exercise in active divination. To navigate a landscape where a vast majority of the dangers are entirely invisible, the subculture has developed its own occult methodologies. Some veterans carry small canvas pouches filled with heavy steel screws or washers wrapped tightly in colored electrical tape. This is a direct adaptation of the bolt-throwing technique from Roadside Picnic and the Stalker video games, used to detect invisible physics anomalies. In the real zone, it's evolved into a form of ritualistic cartomancy. A stalker will cast a weighted bolt into an overgrown path, reading the trajectory of the bounce and the sound of its landing to decipher if the zone is open or hostile to their presence. Every step is governed by omens. The Stalker Creed treats the irradiated wilderness as a conscious, watching entity that communicates through a language of grim signs and portents. If the auguries are bad, if a lone crow is spotted sitting atop an old Soviet milestone, if a gust of wind stirs the dead canopy of the red forest out of nowhere, or if your Geiger counter spikes a sudden, unprovoked warning, the ritual dictates immediate submission. You don't argue with the zone, you abort the mission, turn around, and go home. First stop, the unmistakably Soviet designation of Hospital Number 126. Located deep within the ghost city of Pripyat, this is the true ground zero for the human tragedy of the disaster. In the chaotic early morning hours of April 26, 1986, the initial wave of first responders, the plant operators, and the Pripyat firefighters were rushed here. They were dying of acute radiation syndrome, their bodies absorbing lethal doses of energy from the burning reactor core. Desperate to stop the invisible contamination from spreading through the building, the doctors stripped the men of their gear, heavy canvas jackets, rubber boots, brass helmets, etc., and threw them into a pile in a room in the hospital's dark basement. 4 decades later, that basement remains one of the most radioactive places on Earth. The discarded gear still emits a lethal, concentrated, invisible fire, with radiation levels spiking past 2,000 microsieverts per hour. Stepping into that room for just a few minutes can expose a human body to an entire year's worth of background radiation. But you don't go in the basement. If you're smart, you don't step inside the building at all. The concrete structure is rotting from the inside out, hollowed by decades of rain, snow, and severe frost. The elevator cables snapped long ago, leaving pitch-black shafts exposed in the shadows of the hallways. Multiple trespassers and amateur explorers have stepped backwards into the dark, falling multiple stories to break their bodies on the concrete floor below. And in Hospital Number 126, there is no rescue team. You can't call for help. If you use your phone or radio to alert the emergency services, you are signaling the state authorities. The police will arrive not to rescue you, but to arrest you, fine you, and deport you. If you're broken and bleeding in the dark, the unwritten rule of the Stalkers is absolute. You drag yourself out on your own strength, or you die where you fell. That's the price of admission, Tovarish. Next up is the Jupiter Factory. Located on the desolate outskirts of Pripyat, it was a massive industrial fortress that epitomized Soviet compartmentalization. Officially, the factory was a civilian plant manufacturing components for tape recorders. Secretly, it operated under the direct purview of the Ministry of Defense, utilizing its massive assembly lines to develop advanced military robotics, semiconductor materials, and aircraft black boxes. When the reactor ruptured in 1986, the factory didn't die, it mutated. The state quickly repurposed the heavily shielded abandoned facility into a highly classified radiological testing laboratory. For years, defunded scientists in lead-lined aprons used the site to test decontamination techniques, leaving behind a subterranean nightmare. A sprawling basement network packed with rusted barrels of experimental chemical waste, highly radioactive soil samples, and gray, toxic sludge. But the Stalkers don't avoid Jupiter because of the radiation. They avoid it because of what haunts the main assembly hall. I call them the moving shadows. These are pitch-black, human-shaped silhouettes that glide slowly along the peeling concrete walls, moving deliberately against the incoming shafts of twilight. They're not cast by any physical object. They are independent, autonomous voids. Stalker folklore dictates that if you inadvertently step into a room where these entities manifest, the environment reacts instantly. The ambient temperature drops to a bone-chilling freeze. Electronic equipment fails as camera and flashlight batteries drain to zero in a matter of seconds. Most terrifying of all is the sudden, crushing wave of existential dread that floods the human nervous system. a biological panic response so severe it completely paralyzes the mind. The rule at Jupiter is absolute. You turn around immediately and leave, or you die. Our next point of interest is the Duga radar, the woodpecker, the Russian woodpecker, a massive, towering over-the-horizon radar array standing 150 meters tall and stretching nearly 750 meters wide, hidden deep within the Ukrainian forest near Chernobyl. During the Cold War, this steel colossus emitted a relentless rhythmic tapping signal at a frequency of 10 hertz, completely disrupting global commercial aviation and amateur radio broadcasts. Now the grid is silent. But it's not a true silence. When you stand at the very base of that massive metal web on a day with no wind, you can feel it. A rhythmic, pulsing thrum vibrating inside your skull, felt directly in your head rather than heard through your ears. It feels as though the metal itself is still transmitting, still trying to detect something incoming from beyond the horizon. Within the underground culture of the zone, the Stalkers have integrated this gargantuan grid into their own dark mythos. In Stalker lore, Duga is frequently whispered to be the physical, real-world prototype for the video game's Brain Scorcher, a fictionalized machine capable of emitting a localized, psycho-spiritual wave that utterly fries the cognitive functions of anyone who gets too close to the secrets hidden deep within the zone, leaving them nothing but mindless, wandering husks. This folklore is fed directly by decades of weaponized psychotronic conspiracy theories. Fringe researchers and post-Soviet parajournalists have long argued that the woodpecker's 10 Hz frequency wasn't designed to monitor incoming Western ballistic missiles at all. Instead, they insist it was a massive, state-sponsored mind control experiment. Because the human brain operates on similar alpha and theta wave frequencies, theorists allege that the RBMK-powered Duga array was broadcasting a directed, pulsed electromagnetic signal engineered to penetrate human geography on a global scale, altering moods, inducing compliance, and subtly steering human consciousness from afar. When you look into the deeper history of this milieu, these Cold War theories reveal a direct technical lineage to modern anomalous warfare. Declassified intelligence briefs and investigative journalism reports frequently point to these early Soviet experiments in directed, pulsed radio frequency energy as the exact conceptual and technical precursors to what the modern world calls Havana syndrome. The core mechanics of the two phenomena are chillingly identical. The debilitating spectrum of neurological symptoms reported by modern diplomats, crushing head pressure, intense nausea, spatial disorientation, and a painful, localized acoustic hum that seems to vibrate inside the teeth and bone rather than the ear canal, mirrors the exact physiological footprint attributed to the psychoactive frequencies of the Russian woodpecker. Standing under that rusting cage of iron, feeling that phantom thumping inside your head, the line between historical defense engineering and weaponized neurological horror completely vanishes. Our next stop is the Claw of Pripyat, the Death Bucket, a massive, rusted mechanical shovel that was used to scrape the hyper-radioactive graphite debris off Reactor 4's shattered roof during the primary containment operations. It sits abandoned in the deep forest now, highly radioactive, lethal, and radiating a profound toxic field. Within the modern-day Stalker subculture, checking out the Claw has evolved into the ultimate terrifying rite of passage for extreme illegal trespassers. Legends on underground urbex forums claim that the most daring stalkers will deliberately climb inside its rusted maw, spending the night sheltered within the machinery to prove their spiritual resilience against the zone's invisible fires. Is that bravery or stupidity? In the zone, there's no real difference. To the parapsychologist, however, the Claw isn't just a physical container for radioactive isotopes. It's a cursed totem. Modern esoteric theories suggest that objects heavily saturated by sudden catastrophic radiation can act as accidental psychotronic storage devices. The sheer terror, panic, and abrupt mortality of the liquidators who operated the machinery are believed by fringe researchers to have been fundamentally pressed into the atomic structure of the metal itself. Stalkers who spent time near the artifact describe experiencing intense waking nightmares and vivid phantom sensory memories of metallic tastes and localized heat flash sensations, as if the object is projecting a localized post-traumatic psychic loop into the human mind. Then there are the unfinished cooling towers built for reactors 5 and 6. Never completed. These massive hollow concrete cones loom over the horizon like open sarcophagi. Even the most seasoned stalkers strictly avoid camping inside their colossal concrete rings. The aversion is rooted in a brutal physiological phenomenon. The unique hyper-curved geometry of the unfinished towers acts as a natural acoustic amplifier for wind, converting standard air currents into a constant, concentrated vortex of infrasound. Operating well below the threshold of human hearing, these low-frequency acoustic vibrations trigger a profound evolutionary panic response within the nervous system. Those who step into the center of the towers are immediately struck by overwhelming waves of irrational dread, sudden panic attacks, spontaneous hallucinations, and severe inner ear fluid disruption, leading to vomiting and deep neurological madness. In the pages of early 1990s parajournalism, these concrete chimneys were frequently speculated to be accidental mirrors of the secret Soviet torsion field architecture, monuments where physics and geometry inadvertently aligned to create a localized zone of absolute psychological horror. Our next point of interest is the Budyakhovka graveyard, a subterranean necropolis of irradiated machinery. Unlike the famous surface scrap heaps of Rosokha, Budyakhovka is where the Soviet military buried the most severely contaminated frontline assets. Armored personnel carriers, the massive Mi-6 or Mi-6 heavy transport helicopters, fire engines, and massive lead-shielded bulldozers that operated directly inside the radioactive ruins of Reactor 4. They drove these multi-ton mechanical beasts into 30 parallel, massive clay trenches and interred them like an iron army, sealing them beneath thick caps of compacted earth. Today, the surface looks deceptively empty, but beneath the weeds, the soil is a literal minefield. No one goes there. Within the modern Stalker subculture, Budyakhovka is whispered about with a unique, grounded terror. It's universally considered a dead zone, even by the standards of the Exclusion Zone. The danger isn't just the lethal ambient gamma radiation leaking from the soil. It's a silent, suffocating physics nightmare. Stalkers trade warnings on encrypted chat rooms about the clay gas traps. Over decades of burial, the dense, waterproof clay layers have trapped pockets of highly toxic, decomposing chemicals, engine oils, and subterranean methane. When a reckless trespasser tries to dig into a trench to salvage rare Soviet military components or artifacts, they risk puncturing these pressurized subterranean pockets. In the pitch black of a midnight dig, the odorless oxygen-depleting gas can rush out instantly, causing immediate asphyxiation and dropping a stalker dead into the earth before they ever realize they've stopped breathing. This physical hazard feeds directly into the deeper parapsychological dread of the post-Soviet parajournalists. In the pages of early 90s anomaly journals, Budyakhovka was theorized to be a vast mechanical egregore burial ground. Esoteric writers argued that because these vehicles were the primary buffers between human life and the raw fury of the split atom, the metal hulls absorbed more than just alpha particles. They absorbed the collective psychic shockwave of a collapsing empire. The trenches are treated in folklore as a massive, suppressive grid designed to ground a vast chaotic field of traumatic memory into the earth. To disturb the soil of Budyakhovka isn't just to risk radiation or suffocation, it's an act of deep spiritual transgression. A literal unearthing of weaponized technical ghosts that the state spent millions of rubles to bury forever in the dark. Before we reach our final destination along this nightmarish itinerary, we must address the complex, dangerous ecosystem of the local population. Once you cross that barbed wire fence and begin the grueling 18.6-mile nocturnal march through the pathless swamps, the equivalent of walking nearly 3/4 of a full marathon in total darkness while hauling a 60-pound pack, you're no longer at the top of the food chain. The human and non-human inhabitants of this wasteland form a strict hierarchy of threats that ranges from the deeply tragic to the utterly inexplicable. The first tier of the zone's human geography belongs to the aforementioned Samosli, the self-settlers. These are the stubborn, elderly re-immigrants who defied Soviet evacuation orders in 1986, marching right back past military checkpoints to reclaim their ancestral wooden cottages. In the folklore of the Stalker subculture, the Samosli are a profound wild card. They can be a Stalker's greatest tactical advantage or their immediate undoing. On a good night, a hospitable Samosli elder might offer you a bowl of hot borscht, a bed of straw, and invaluable operational intelligence on recent border patrol movements. On a bad night, you face an entirely different reality. These people have spent 40 years surviving in a lawless, irradiated wilderness. They're intensely territorial, deeply paranoid, and almost universally armed with old Soviet hunting shotguns or scavenged military ordnance. If you stumble onto their property unannounced in the dead of night, lucky enough to have avoided any of the potential man-traps that surround what are, in the eyes of officialdom, heavily guarded hostile squats, they will not hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. Before you ever have to worry about the major predators of the wasteland, however, you will have to survive the literal blood tax of the territory. The outside world watches glossy documentaries about the feral dogs reclaiming the concrete or the phantom wolves hunting the tree lines, but those are clean, visible threats. For a stalker crawling through the tall grass, the most immediate, inescapable physical torment comes from the unseen fabric of the air, the insects. There's actually a whole entire new mutated strain of worms that live in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, but you don't have to worry about them. They're harmless. Because the 30-kilometer zone is essentially a massive, unmanaged marshland punctuated by stagnant drainage canals, cooling ponds, and flooded basement networks. It's become an absolute engine for mosquitoes, midges, and horseflies. They don't roam in normal clouds. They hang over the bogs in massive, choking columns. And in the zone, an insect bite isn't just an annoyance, it's a potential microdose of internal radiation. The biological reality is chilling. Mosquito larvae develop in the wet anaerobic mud of the Pripyat riverbanks and the stagnant swamps. The exact geological points where the heaviest insoluble hot particles of plutonium, strontium, and cesium settled in 1986. The larvae feed directly on this radioactive silt, incorporating the isotopes into their developing cellular matrices. When the adult females hatch and take flight, they carry that internal atomic payload with them. When they swarm a stalker, biting through standard canvas or finding a seam in a respirator strap, they aren't just drawing blood. They're driving a microscopic needle coated in contaminated river muck and organic radionuclides straight past the protective barrier of human skin and directly into your bloodstream. Stalkers who infiltrate during the damp summer months describe the sheer, exhausting paranoia of the bugs, the continuous, high-pitched whining of thousands of wings echoing inside your ears in the dark, knowing that every successful strike is subtly altering your internal dosimeter. You're forced to bake in your heavy tactical gear, sweating through thick layers in the humid heat, because exposing a square inch of flesh means letting the swamp feed directly on your veins. And yet, as exhausting as the airborne swarms are, they are merely the heralds of the heavy kinetic terror waiting further down the path. Because when the frantic buzzing of the marsh suddenly falls stone silent and the thick undergrowth begins to bend, that's when you know the true rulers of the woods have arrived. If the Samosli represent a calculated human risk, the true grinding physical terror of the zone belongs to the tusked swarms, the wild boars. When the outside world turns its attention to the radio-ecological fallout of Chernobyl, the media inevitably focuses on the iconic imagery of the wasteland, the skeletal packs of feral dogs roaming the concrete of Pripyat, or the ghost story wolves reclaiming the red forest. Those predators are a known, visible quantity. But within the actual lived experience of the illegal stalker subculture, the wolves and dogs are secondary concerns. The lesser known and far more immediate, not to mention profoundly nightmarish threat, is the tusked swarm. These aren't the standard timid game animals of the Western European woods. These literal inbred swine have been completely reshaped by 40 years of isolation and radioactive saturation. Driven by a diet composed almost entirely of hyper-radioactive underground roots, irradiated tubers, and subterranean mushroom mycelium, these boars are walking repositories of cesium-137 and strontium-90. Over generations, the continuous internal radiation combined with a total lack of any human hunting pressures, have triggered an aggressive physiological drift. They have grown to monstrous, heavily armored proportions, with alpha males frequently exceeding 300 kilograms. That's roughly 666 pounds of pissed off pig. Actually, it's 660, but 666 is way cooler. A pissed off pig. Nearly double the mass of a normal continental boar. The chronic radiation has caused a dense thickening of their subcutaneous tissues, resulting in a hide so calloused and leathery and caked in radioactive mud that standard low-caliber firearms will simply deflect or deform against their shoulders. Their skulls have widened, and their tusks, brittle but brutally sharp due to radiation-induced bone fragmentation, protrude outwards like irregular, serrated scythes. They are dense, low-slung kinetic battering rams, completely adapted to a hostile dead world. In the real-world folklore and survival strategies of the zone, these beasts occupy a psychological space identical to a classic zombie horde. They're terrifying not because of any supernatural or psychic abilities, but because of their absolute numerical advantage, relentless aggression, and unnerving pack intelligence. Clever girl. A single boar can easily rip through tactical canvas and shatter a human femur with a single headbutt, but they rarely operate as lone predators. They travel in massive, coordinated swarms that move through the thick undergrowth like a single multi-headed organism. If a swarm catches a stalker's scent in the open forest or along the marshy banks, an immediate mechanical hunting process begins. Unlike wolves, which might stalk a target looking for weaknesses, the boars use a relentless, unbroken forward press. Their sense of smell is acute enough to trace a boot print through standing water, and once the target is locked, they don't stop. They crash through the brush with a deafening, chaotic noise, a terrifying wall of snapping branches, deep rhythmic grunting, and the wet thudding of hundreds of hooves. As they close the gap, the swarm fans out using basic herd hunting physics to cut off any passive retreat. They utilize the terrain, driving the explorer away from open asphalt and deep into thick mud or dense brush where human movement is severely restricted. If they catch a stalker on the ground without a climbable pine tree, a concrete wall, or an abandoned vehicle nearby, the end is swift and incredibly violent. The lead boars will charge at full speed, targeting the knees and shins to break the explorer's stance and drop them to the earth. And once the stalker is down, the swarm moves in simultaneously. They don't kill with a clean bite to the throat. They kill through a chaotic, agonizing process of trampling, crushing weight, and repetitive upward goring motions with their razor-sharp tusks. Within minutes, a human being is completely dismantled, their gear crushed into the irradiated topsoil. For an illegal explorer navigating the deep woods under the cover of darkness, hearing that sudden coordinated chorus of heavy grunting rising from the fog isn't just an alert, it's an absolute, inescapable death sentence. As you venture deeper into the interior towards the dead heart of the zone, the folklore detaches from biological reality and enters the territory of pure high strangeness. This is where urban legends speak of the entities born from the radioactive and psychotronic residue of the state's bleak secret history. Before we descend into the truly monstrous taxonomy of the zone's folklore, we have to look at the grim, deeply ironic linguistics used by the people who walk these woods. When a stalker peers into a pitch-black cellar and whispers that the Koresh are waiting down there, a Western listener might instantly think of religious cults or apocalyptic prophets. But the truth is entirely localized and far more heartbreaking. In Russian street slang and the historical coded language of the Soviet criminal underworld, Koresh means old pal, buddy, or partner in crime. It stems from the root word for a tree. Calling these entities the Koresh is an exercise in pure post-Soviet gallows humor. The local trespassers who coined the term knew exactly what these creatures were. These weren't alien monsters, but former neighbors, construction laborers, and reactor technicians who were left behind by a collapsing empire. To look into the dark and call them your old buddies is a reminder that the feral predators tracking you from the sewer pipes used to be your fellow man. And they are not alone in the dark. Deep within the labyrinthian, half-collapsed subterranean utility tunnels and drainage networks beneath Pripyat and Chernobyl 2 hide the Koresh, or the mutant hermits, as they're also called. According to persistent zone folklore, these creatures are the tragic, terrifying remnants of original citizens, construction laborers, and plant workers who actively refused to board the evacuation buses in April 1986. Instead of fleeing the radioactive fallout on the surface, they vanished completely into the massive, multi-level underground infrastructure of the complex, sealing their fate beneath the concrete. Decades of surviving in total absolute darkness, drinking highly contaminated water pooling in the lower drainage sumps, and feeding on heavily irradiated rodents have resulted in a horrific, localized human degeneration. The folklore describes them as completely feral, hairless, and stooped beings who have entirely lost the capacity for human speech, communicating instead through low guttural clicks and a rhythmic, intentional scraping of scrap metal against the iron utility pipes to map out the darkness. The Koresh are not passive ghosts. They're an active, predatory threat to the modern explorer, and their tactics are defined by a deep, terrifying exploitation of the zone's architecture. They utilize the floor grates and maintenance hatches of the dead concrete buildings as hunting blinds. A common chilling anecdote passed down through the illegal urbex community involves the vertical stalk. An explorer walking through the dark corridors of an abandoned school or laboratory will suddenly realize that the dust on the floor is filtering downward. Directly beneath them in the crawl space, a Koresh is tracking their footsteps by sound, moving silently through the pipe racks just inches below the explorer's boots, waiting for a rusted section of concrete or an open maintenance well to strike. They don't hunt with weapons, but with a desperate, frantic, kinetic violence born of complete starvation. They raid Stalker food stashes with calculated ferocity, but more than one samizdat account from the mid-1990s suggests a far darker reality. Early Ukrainian border guards whispered about recovered Stalker gear found deep in the municipal drainage systems, packs entirely emptied of canned meat, left alongside clothing that had been violently shredded from the inside out. To mark their territory, the Koresh leave primitive, deeply unsettling mud markings on the concrete walls. These aren't symbols or language, but repetitive, five-finger drag marks caked in heavy, radioactive subterranean clay. They serve as a physical boundary line for the living surface world. Once a stalker spots those damp, low-set handprints tracking along the baseboards, it means the structure beneath their feet belongs entirely to the dark. To understand the raw reality of this folklore, one has to look back to the early, unrefined years of the zone's containment. In the winter of 1994, a team of official radioecological surveyors mapping out the deep utility conduits beneath the Pripyat Jupiter factory reported a terrifying, non-biological anomaly that has since become a cornerstone of local Stalker history. While taking sediment samples from a dry cable vault, the team's flashlights caught a sudden erratic movement near a collapsed brick partition. Expecting a stray dog or a wild boar, the lead engineer focused his beam on a low alcove. Instead, the team documented a pale, completely hairless, stooped entity huddled against the copper wiring. The entity didn't flee. It didn't growl. Instead, it slowly turned its head towards the high-intensity white light, exposing a face where the eyes had become severely clouded over with thick cataracts, a direct physiological consequence of continuous, lifelong darkness and chronic, heavy radiation exposure. As the team scrambled backwards, the entity began emitting a rapid, rhythmic clicking noise against the roof of its mouth, which was immediately answered by an identical, echoing click from a completely separate, pitch-black pipe shaft further down the corridor. The surveyors abandoned their equipment and fled to the surface, refusing to re-enter the Jupiter subterranean grid without an armed military escort. When you hear that rhythmic thumping on the plumbing pipes while trying to sleep in an upper-floor castle apartment, you quickly realize that the concrete under your sleeping bag isn't a shield. It's a roof for a completely different, forgotten kingdom. Even more unsettling are the enigmatic monstrosities known in parajournalism archives and the urbex Stalker subculture as the bioplastics. Unlike the aggressive Koresh, the bioplastics are a source of profound, quiet dread. Stalkers tracking the deep forest lines toward the reactor have reported spotting figures dressed in perfect Soviet-era military camouflage, complete with backpacks and respirators, walking along the overgrown tree lines. The horror only registers when you get closer. The folklore states that their movements are fundamentally wrong, a jerky, mechanical, stop-motion gait like a mannequin trying to replicate human walking from an incomplete manual. Those who've caught glimpses beneath their hoods describe faces that are perfectly smooth, gray, and entirely devoid of any human features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. The bioplastics never attack, and their motives remain entirely unknown. They simply pace the perimeter of the inner installations, staring blankly with featureless heads before melting back into the radioactive brush. The prevailing theory among veteran stalkers is that the zone itself is an intelligent learning laboratory. And after 40 years of absorbing human DNA, human military gear, and human culture, the territory is actively trying to replicate us. And the bioplastics are its unsettling beta version probes. In an environment where the fabric of reality was fundamentally ruptured, the landscape itself acts as a massive recording tape for trauma. Stalkers frequently report running into intense residual hauntings, localized acoustic and visual time loops that have nothing to do with traditional spiritualism, but everything to do with psychogeographical scar tissue. When camping in the abandoned schools or nurseries of Pripyat, explorers describe waking up in the dead of night to the sudden crystal-clear sounds of a bustling city, the distant overlapping chatter of thousands of voices, the rhythmic rumble of Soviet evacuation buses idling in the streets, and the shrill, echoing announcements of emergency sirens broadcasting over loudspeakers. These loops are completely non-interactive. They're phantom sensory overlapping. The structural memory of April 1986 permanently burned into the concrete and iron by the sheer kinetic and radioactive violence of the disaster. Hovering over this entire hierarchy of dread is the most famous, enduring myth of the exclusion zone, the White Stalker. Unlike the monsters of the military, the White Stalker is a solitary, ambivalent phantom figure. The legend describes him as a lone explorer wearing a pristine, glowing white hazmat suit that never gathers soot, radioactive dust, or mud, moving without effort through the most lethal hotspots of the reactor core without a dosimeter. He's the ultimate psycho-mythical projection of the zone's internal logic. To the desperate or the dying, he's a figure of unexpected salvation. Scores of real-world stalker anecdotes tell of explorers who became completely lost in the swamps, ran out of water, or were pinned down by wild boars, only to see a silent figure in glowing white appear in the distance, wordlessly guiding them back to a safe path or secure castle apartment before vanishing into thin air. Yet the White Stalker is completely unaligned. He's just as frequently reported acting as a cold, terrifying avatar of the zone's judgment, meting out brutal, swift punishment to greedy looters, vandals, or those who disrespect the quiet of the dead zones by abandoning their injured companions. He embodies the fundamental spiritual law of the wasteland. The zone lets you live when you're supposed to live, and it claims you when you're supposed to die. The White Stalker is merely the territory's way of delivering that final absolute verdict. Yet long before the White Stalker ever patrolled the concrete ruins, local folklore recorded an even darker harbinger that belongs to the very genesis of the disaster. The entity known across international parapsychology archives as the Black Bird of Chernobyl. According to persistent accounts leaked from the archives of early Ukrainian parajournalists, in the frantic weeks leading up to the catastrophic explosion on April 26, 1986, a select group of plant workers, engineers, and citizens in the city of Pripyat began experiencing an identical suffocating nightmare. They dreamed of a towering, shadow-cloaked figure with massive, membranous wings and piercing, hypnotic red eyes. Soon the nightmare broke through into waking reality. Multiple eyewitnesses reported catching glimpses of this massive, headless, dark avian silhouette gliding soundlessly through the mist over the RBMK reactor blocks or standing motionless atop the cooling towers in the twilight. Those who looked directly into the phantom red eyes were immediately struck with a paralyzing sense of dread, followed by intense, unexplainable phantom telephone calls at their homes, calls that yielded nothing but static and a low, rhythmic clicking sound. For students of global high strangeness, the physiological and conceptual parallels are immediate and undeniable. This is the exact terrifying calling card of Point Pleasant's Mothman. From an omenological standpoint, the blackbird functions not as a physical predator, but as a cosmic sentinel of doom. It's an entity that seems to gravitate exclusively toward fractured geography and impending technological cataclysms, feeding on or mirroring the localized buildup of mass human trauma before it occurs. The legend reaches its terrifying climax at exactly 1:23 a.m. on that fateful April morning. As Reactor 4 tore itself apart in a column of radioactive fire, several liquidators rushing to the scene reported seeing the massive winged shadows circle the burning core one final time, silhouetted against the lethal, glowing blue beam of ionized air, before melting away into the smoke. It hasn't been seen in the zone ever since. It's fulfilled its purpose, it's watched the hinge of history break, and then it vanished, leaving the wasteland to the lesser ghosts it left behind. Before I move to our final destination, a crucial boundary must be drawn. It's easy for an outsider sitting comfortably out there in the big earth to hear names like the Koresh, the bioplastics, the white stalker, or the blackbird, and dismiss them as the hyperactive world building of a survival horror video game. But they are not game mechanics. They are not lines of code written to entertain a player with a controller sitting in the comforts of their own home. The cold truth of the Exclusion Zone is that these names were forged on encrypted forums, whispered over campfires in radioactive basements, and scrawled into the journals of genuine urban explorers. These categories exist in the Stalker taxonomy for one reason, and one reason only: eyewitness consensus. Multiple unrelated individuals, hardened, cynical trespassers who entered the zone looking for nothing more than concrete and adrenaline, have stepped into the dark and collided with these realities. They didn't hit a checkpoint or a cutscene. They hit a wall of primal evolutionary terror. They experienced the physical somatic reality of the fight-or-flight response, the instantaneous spike of adrenaline, the heavy freeze of the muscles when the brain realizes it's looking at something that defies known biology, the desperate blind flight through pitch-black ruins because the air around them just suddenly felt wrong. Whether these entities are physical mutations, psychological projections born from prolonged radiation exposure and sensory deprivation, or something truly anomalous breaking through the cracked fabric of Pripyat, they occupy a very real, very terrifying space in human geography. They've been deemed inhabitants of the zone because they've claimed it, and they've forced the people who illegally walk these woods to acknowledge their presence. They're real enough to make an armed soldier run, real enough to make a seasoned stalker freeze, and real enough to ensure that when you look outside your castle window into the midnight gloom of a dead city, you never ever look for too long. We have now officially reached the end of our nightmare itinerary. We've braved the military patrols at the perimeter, survived the 18.6-mile march through the radioactive swamps, and cataloged the feral, mutated, and anomalous entities that have claimed the wasteland. And now we stand at the dead center of all of this high strangeness. The final stop is the absolute most unsettling, psychologically devastating landscape in the entire exclusion zone. A multi-tiered monument to a stolen childhood that's permanently curdled into the supernatural. To understand this final nightmare, you must first look down at the dirt beneath your boots. Just a few kilometers from the reactor complex lies the ghost village of Kopachi. You won't see any houses here, because the wooden structures of the village absorbed such catastrophic levels of initial fallout in 1986, Soviet liquidators made a radical, desperate architectural decision. They bulldozed the entire town into the earth. Every home, every barn, every personal belonging was buried alive under massive artificial dirt mounds, marked only by small, rusted triangles bearing the radiation symbol. Only one single building was left standing above the graves: the brick and concrete Kopachi Kindergarten. It stands as a solitary rotting tombstone surrounded by the buried remains of the town. Inside, the imagery is pure, unadulterated psychological rot. Rusted iron cribs sit in rows. Moldering Soviet dolls with melted plastic eyes lie half buried in the radioactive dust alongside children's notebooks with final entries frozen mid-sentence. But the real terror of Kooooooooooooooooooooooks isn't what was left behind, it's what was trapped beneath. Stalkers who've committed the ultimate structural taboo of camping inside or near the kindergarten report that the night belongs to a horrifying, localized residual time loop. In the dead of night, the silence of the swamps is shattered by the sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps. Not scattered or frantic, but disciplined, military-style marching cadence moving directly across and beneath the buried earth mounds. Then comes the audio profile that drives explorers out of their minds. Rising from the floorboards and the surrounding dirt graves comes a muffled, highly distorted, echoing choir of children's voices chanting old Soviet young pioneer anthems. It sounds like a vinyl record playing at the wrong speed, warping and bending in pitch. The folklore among veteran trespassers whispers of something even darker than standard ghosts, the existence of child Koresh. They believe that a handful of the village children evaded the initial liquidation, hiding deep within the root cellars and underground storage bunkers while the world above them was literally buried alive, leaving a legacy of feral, subterranean descendants who still march to the rhythm of a dead empire in the pitch-black dark. If Kooooooooooooooooooooks is the buried trauma of the zone, then the final stop on the tour is its ultimate skyward-reaching monolith of dread, the Pripyat Amusement Park. Located in the center of the city, this park was scheduled to have its grand opening on May 1st, 1986, as part of the Soviet May Day celebrations. The catastrophic rupture at Reactor 4 occurred 5 days prior. The park was never opened. Its pristine, yellow-cabined Ferris wheel, a structure meant to embody the peak of Soviet atomic-age leisure, became an immediate towering lightning rod for the invisible cloud of radionuclides billowing forth from the burning reactor core. Today, the Pripyat Ferris wheel stands as a hyper-lethal, rusting kinetic anchor. The moss growing on its support structures and the soil directly beneath its massive iron frame represent some of the highest, most erratic radiation hotspots in the entire city, causing dosimeters to scream in continuous, unbroken sirens. But the high strangeness of the Ferris wheel isn't just radio-ecological, it's deeply, profoundly interactive. Stalkers tracking through the park square on windless, dead, silent nights have documented the massive multi-ton wheel suddenly experiencing a localized kinetic awakening. Without a single breath of wind in the air, the rusted yellow cabins will begin to sway violently on their hinges, accompanied by a deafening metallic groaning that echoes across the abandoned concrete plazas of the city. Even more disturbing are the visual anomalies. Trespassers using high-grade night vision optics from the upper floors of nearby Castle apartments have reported seeing faint, luminescent, child-sized silhouettes sitting perfectly still inside the yellow cars as they reach the apex of the wheel, staring blankly out towards the glowing sarcophagus of the reactor block before the entire mechanism falls stone silent once again. This is where our itinerary terminates. At the intersection of a buried kindergarten and a Ferris wheel that never turned for the living. True nature of the exclusion zone is fully laid bare. It's easy to look at this landscape from the safety of the big earth and see nothing but a cautionary tale of atomic hubris, a graveyard of concrete, iron, and stolen time. But to view it strictly as a place of death is to completely miss the mysterious magnetic frequency that keeps drawing the stalkers back past the barbed wire. The zone is a paradox. It's a territory that strips away every comfort, every illusion, and every lie of modern civilization, leaving you with nothing but your own raw heartbeat against the darkness. It's dangerous, it's contaminated, and it's entirely indifferent to your survival. Yet in that absolute indifference, there's a profoundly terrifying freedom. It's the only place left on Earth where the rules of the old world are completely void, and where the boundaries between history, myth, and high strangeness have completely dissolved into the mist. As we turn our backs on the rusting spires of Pripyat and look back towards the perimeter, a lingering, uncomfortable realization begins to take hold of the mind. The dread you feel at this moment isn't just a reaction to the horror, it's a form of gravity, a quiet building curiosity, a strange, undeniable need that whispers to you in those quiet moments. Because once you've looked into the honest, unvarnished dark of the dead cities, part of you stays there forever. The tour may be over, but the zone is still out there, waiting, clicking, counting down, and sooner or later, you might just find yourself pulling on a backpack, checking your dosimeter, and choosing to cross the wire one midnight to see what's waiting for you on the dark side. That's going to do it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Man, I knew a little bit about this Chernobyl, urbex, Stalker underground culture a little bit, but when I started getting into it, it was endlessly fascinating. I can't believe, I mean, you know, there's all kinds of strange, weird tourism, dark tourism subcultures, and this is probably right there at the top. I know that Fukushima has something kind of similar, but they're a little more guided tour style. Not this sort of DIY survivalist, definitely not feral human, radioactive mutant, crawling, infested sort of environment. So yeah. Yeah, there's gonna be a little companion episode piece to this that's going to cover some of the more obscure post-Soviet parajournalism, urban legends, and urbex legends, and just some of the weirder alleged high strangeness stories that came out in these parajournalism periodicals and publications after the Soviet Union fell. A lot of this stuff is pretty crazy. I'd never heard of a lot of it. I just kind of stumbled across this treasure trove of like weird post-Soviet just secrets, quote-unquote conspiracy theories, just things that were featured in those parajournalism publications. And we'll get into a couple of those on the companion piece to this. Thank you guys for listening. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.
Knock, knock. Who's there? Vodka? Vodka who? Knock, knock. Who's there? Vodka. 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 Vodka who? Knock, knock.